On an October evening in 1957, while Americans were eating dinner, watching TV comedies, and thinking more about new car models than about outer space, a small metal ball the size of a beach cooler streaked silently across the sky above their heads. It gave off nothing more than a faint electronic beep, beep, beep. But that sound, rebroadcast on American radio stations, would shake the White House, rattle the Pentagon, and force the President of the United States to rethink what it meant that the Soviets had reached space first. Newspapers the next morning treated it like a new Pearl Harbor in slow motion. Three-line, eight-column banner headlines screamed that the Soviet Union had launched an Earth satellite, a man-made moon. Newsweek even scrapped an entire prepared cover on Detroit's flashy new car designs and rushed out an issue with Sputnik on the front, explaining the Red Conquest and asking what it meant that the United States, the self-proclaimed leader of science and industry, was suddenly second into space. For ordinary Americans, used to seeing their country as unbeatable in technology, from the atomic bomb to jet bombers and television sets, the idea that the first object in orbit was stamped with a red star felt like waking up to find the future had someone else's logo on it. In those first hours, though, the man at the top seemed almost strangely calm. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the five-star general who had commanded D-Day and now sat in the Oval Office, did not rush to the cameras with a dramatic national address. He did not call it a crisis. He didn't demand emergency votes in Congress. Behind closed doors, he told his cabinet, "We can still destroy Russia. We know it," reminding them that in terms of nuclear warheads and real strategic power, the United States still held the stronger hand. To Eisenhower, a veteran of real battlefields, one small ball in the sky looked like noise, not a decisive blow. 5 days later, facing a room packed with reporters, Eisenhower gave the country his public verdict on Sputnik. The launch, he said, did not raise his apprehensions not one iota. He emphasized that he had already provided the U.S. satellite and missile efforts with funds to the limit of his ability, and that is all I can do, signaling that he did not intend to be stampeded into panic spending by a Soviet publicity coup. "We never considered ourselves to be in a race," he told journalists, as if the whole idea of a space race had been cooked up by headline writers, not by his own advisors or the Kremlin. Around him, his inner circle echoed the same tone. White House aide Sherman Adams joked that the United States had no interest in an outer space basketball game, downplaying the strategic value of a beeping sphere. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles sent a memo calling Sputnik an event of considerable technical and scientific importance, but insisting its importance should not be exaggerated and that its value to mankind would be highly problematical for a long time. In the first official story out of Washington, Sputnik was something like a Soviet fireworks show. Impressive, maybe, a little unnerving, but not a reason to rewrite U.S. defense policy. What Eisenhower knew, and most Americans didn't, helps explain that initial shrug. Thanks to U-2 spy plane flights and careful intelligence work, he had a clearer picture of the real balance of missiles and warheads than the public did. Classified estimates showed that the Soviet Union lagged far behind the United States in nuclear stockpiles and was nowhere near the mythical invincible force that some commentators imagined after Sputnik's launch. From that vantage point, it made sense for him to resist hysteria. He did not want to spend hundreds of billions chasing a missile gap that on paper actually favored the United States. He also had his reasons for letting the Soviets go first in one particular sense. Since 1955, Eisenhower and his advisors had quietly championed the idea of freedom of space, the principle that spacecraft could cross over other nations' territories without violating their sovereignty, just as ships crossed the high seas. If the Soviets orbited a satellite without anyone filing diplomatic protests, it would set a legal precedent that future American spy satellites could use, allowing the United States to look into the Soviet heartland from orbit without asking permission. In that sense, the first Soviet launch solved a tricky diplomatic problem for Washington, and Eisenhower privately welcomed what it meant for the future of American spy satellites. But outside the White House bubble, Americans were not thinking about legal precedents or quiet U-2 overflights. They were staring at that man-made moon and wondering if it meant the enemy could now drop a bomb on any U.S. city from space. They listened to the eerie beep, beep, beep on the radio and heard not just science, but threat, a communist achievement echoing over their own backyards. Public opinion polls and internal memos showed decided concern at home and in friendly countries, with many fearing that the balance of military power had shifted or would soon shift in favor of Moscow. The shock deepened as pundits and politicians framed Sputnik not simply as a military issue, but as an indictment of American society itself. Editorials asked if U.S. schools had gone soft on math and science, if American kids were falling behind Soviet students drilled in physics and engineering. Aeration Week and other influential publications blasted the administration for pinching pennies and making ill-informed decisions that they claimed cost the nation its technological leadership. Suddenly, chrome-plated tail fins and color TVs looked less like emblems of victory and more like distractions in a country that had supposedly forgotten how to build the hardest machines. The political temperature climbed even higher when in December 1957, the United States tried to answer Sputnik with its own highly public rocket launch. The Navy's Vanguard TV-3 booster lifted a small satellite off the pad at Cape Canaveral, rose a few feet, and then crumpled back in an explosion of fire and debris on live television with the world watching. Soviet propagandists mocked the Sputnik, and American cartoonists had a grim laugh, and many citizens felt a deeper sting. Not only had the Soviets moved first, the U.S. response had literally blown up on the launch pad in front of their eyes. Under that pressure, Eisenhower's calm started to look less like wisdom and more like aloofness. His approval rating slid. Journalists described his Sputnik press conference as one of the most hostile of his presidency, and critics portrayed him as a golf-playing grandfather out of touch with a new technological battlefield. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson seized the issue, holding hearings that framed Sputnik as a symbol of American decline and warning that whoever controlled space would control the Earth beneath it. For a president who prided himself on steady nerves, it was a harsh reminder that in a television age, public fear could reshape the strategic map as surely as any missile launch. Then another explosive document landed on Eisenhower's desk, the Gaither Report, a secret assessment commissioned to evaluate U.S. vulnerability to Soviet nuclear attack. Delivered in November 1957, just weeks after Sputnik, it painted a dire picture, a United States dangerously exposed to a surprise strike, in need of massive new spending on bomber shelters, bombers, missiles, and air defenses. The report's authors urged dramatic budget increases and warned that without them, the country could lose the arms race and possibly the next war. Eisenhower thought the Gaither report overshot reality. He believed its estimates of Soviet missile strength were inflated, and its prescriptions for huge spending hikes were politically and economically reckless. He chose to shelve most of its recommendations and keep it highly classified, deciding that feeding the public a diet of worst-case scenarios would do more harm than good. But leaking is a fact of life in Washington, and bits of Gaither soon appeared in the press, reinforcing the idea that a missile gap yawned over America and that the administration was not leveling with the people about how far behind the country had fallen.
At this point, even Eisenhower's closest allies recognized that the president could not rely on quiet confidence alone. The crisis was no longer just about rockets and satellites, it was about national prestige and public trust. Historians looking back argue that this was where Eisenhower made his biggest misstep, not in underestimating Soviet strength, but in underestimating how much it would matter to average citizens that the first object in space was Soviet, not American. He had been explicitly warned as early as 1955 in National Security Council documents and RAND studies that the first nation to launch a satellite would enjoy a major psychological victory around the world. Now he was watching that prediction come true in the headlines. To his credit, Eisenhower did adjust. If he continued to project calm in public, behind the scenes, he began reshaping the way the United States organized science, technology, and education. He summoned his scientific advisors more often, and in November 1957, he took the unprecedented step of creating a full-time position of Presidential Science Advisor. The man he tapped was James R. Killian, Jr., president of MIT, who left his university post to chair a new President's Science Advisory Committee, PSAC, and help Eisenhower navigate a world in which oscilloscopes and orbits mattered as much as tanks and trenches. Killian later recalled that his appointment came as a result of the successful launching of Sputnik 1 and the near hysteria it produced in the United States. His mission, as he saw it, was to help turn that panic into a constructive challenge in science, education, and policy rather than a blind rush into wasteful military projects. Under his guidance, PSAC pushed for reforms in science and math education, more investment in basic research, and a more coherent national strategy for space. Changes that would outlast any single crisis and shape the whole trajectory of the Cold War. At the same time, Eisenhower and Congress set about building new institutions that still define American technological power today. In early 1958, the administration created the Advanced Research Projects Agency, ARPA, inside the Department of Defense to oversee high-risk, high-reward technological programs that cut across the Army, Navy, and Air Force. By centralizing cutting-edge work on rockets, satellites, and other far-out technologies, ARPA was meant to prevent duplication, avoid inter-service turf wars, and ensure that the United States would never again be caught flat-footed by a surprise like Sputnik. Over the decades, that same agency, later renamed DARPA, would help seed technologies from stealth aircraft to the early internet. Even more visible to the public was the birth of NASA. In July 1958, Eisenhower signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, transforming the old NACA Aeronautics Committee into a full-fledged civilian space agency. This move did several things at once. It signaled that the United States would not leave space entirely to the military, but would make it a domain of open exploration and science, even as national security interests remained in the background. It created a clear focal point for American efforts to design rockets, capsules, and missions that could match and surpass Soviet achievements. And it projected to the world a message of confidence. The United States was organizing for the long haul in space, not just scrambling to respond to last month's headlines. Eisenhower's team also understood that the roots of long-term competition with the Soviet Union ran down into classrooms and campuses. In September 1958, he signed the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, a sweeping law that poured federal money into mathematics, science, and foreign language education from grade school through graduate study. The law funded new textbooks, science labs, and teacher training, and it created scholarship and loan programs that helped a generation of students pursue advanced degrees in STEM fields. For the first time, Washington was telling local school boards and parents that what happened in physics class was as much about national defense as what happened in boot camp. Killian and PSAC played a crucial role here as well, arguing that the U.S. could keep pace with Russian scientific advances only if it revitalized its own education system. Historian Zuyoi Wang later wrote that Killian attempted with considerable success to turn Sputnik into a challenge in science, education, and presidential science advising, and the NDEA was one of the clearest fruits of that effort. In a very real sense, the engineer walking into a NASA control room in the 1960s, or the programmer sitting down at an early ARPANET terminal, was a product of decisions triggered by the shock Eisenhower had first tried to shrug off. Looking back decades later, analysts would say that Eisenhower's greatest error in the Sputnik affair was not ignoring the technical threat, but failing at first to grasp the psychological dimension of letting someone else be first into orbit. Sputnik was never just about science, it was about how Americans saw themselves and how the rest of the world judged the contest between two rival systems. Once he recognized that, he quietly used the crisis to lock in changes the Science Advisor, PSAC, ARPA, NASA, and NDEA that would make American technological leadership deeper and more resilient than before. For American viewers today, there is a familiar emotional pattern in this story. At first, the roles seem reversed. The Soviets are the ones delivering the surprise, and the United States is the power caught off guard, forced to admit that its rival has done something astonishing. That feeling of being second, of watching someone else's rocket cross the sky, is uncomfortably close to how German officers once described their first encounters with American industrial strength and logistics in World War II, or how Axis pilots reacted as U.S. carrier groups and bombers began to dominate the air. But then the long arc bends the other way. The same reforms Eisenhower put in motion in response to Sputnik, NASA's creation, ARPA's projects, the new pipelines of scientists and engineers trained under NDEA funds, laid the groundwork for the 1960s space program that would send American astronauts to the moon. In 1957, Soviet officials watched the Western press go wild over their tiny fellow traveler and realized they had stumbled into a propaganda windfall. Now they were watching grainy images of American astronauts planting a flag on lunar soil broadcast around the world, forced to confront a new reality. The Americans had not only caught up, they had leapt far ahead in the most spectacular way possible. From an American point of view, that reversal is where pride and fascination come together. It is one thing to be told that your country is number one. It is another to see that when challenged, it can reorganize itself at every level, from cabinet offices and research agencies to classrooms and TV screens, and turn a rival's moment of triumph into the starting gun for its own greater achievements. The Soviets had their night of beeping glory in 1957. What followed was a decade in which U.S. rockets, U.S. computers, and U.S. engineering would redefine what superpower technology meant and leave Soviet planners scrambling to keep up. That's the heart of Eisenhower's Sputnik shock as a Cold War story for American audiences. At first, the President of the United States looks like he got it wrong, coolly dismissing a man-made moon that clearly mattered to millions of frightened and humiliated citizens. But beneath the surface, his eventual response built a machine that would not only erase the embarrassment, but also force the Soviets into their own moment of dawning realization. The realization that American technological momentum, once fully engaged, was something to fear and respect every bit as much as those beeps from the first satellite. In that sense, this is not just a story about how the United States reacted when the Soviets reached space first. It's a story about how that shock set off a chain reaction through the Oval Office, Congress, laboratories, and schools that turned a moment of doubt into another chapter in a larger narrative. A narrative in which again and again rivals underestimate what happens when American science, industry, and education move in the same direction. And it's that larger narrative, the shock, the response, and the reversal, that keeps Americans watching these Cold War stories with a mix of pride, curiosity, and a certain grim satisfaction, knowing that even when the other side got the first beep, it was the United States that wrote the ending.